Wonderful. Okay, so thank you. Lovely. Thanks ever so much, everybody. My name is Fiona Lynch, and I'm the Head of Nursing for Children's and Sexual Health at University Hospital Sussex, the West End, so Chichester and Worthing. And I'm going to talk to you about the usefulness of patient diaries in paediatric intensive care. So firstly, thanks ever so much for accepting my abstract and inviting me to talk to you today. And also have to give a shout out to my PhD supervisors, who's Jos Latour and Ruth Endicott, and of course to everybody who contributed to this study. So the aims of the update study and of this presentation is really just to give you first off an overview of what a patient diary is. And obviously, I'm going to focus particularly on PICU. So prior to being a head of nursing, I was in PICU for 24 years. That experience had led me then to want to undertake a PhD and carry on with additional research. So I'll talk to you about the update study, and I'm going to give you some of the initial findings and themes that come out from this particular study. So first of all, what is a patient diary? Well, they were introduced by myself and an amazing play specialist called Jane Sivier, probably about 9 years ago now, on the PICU at the Evelina at London, which is a really large, both general and cardiac PICU. And as you can see,
Fiona, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Fiona. Your slides aren't moving on at the moment.
Handbook. Yeah.
Sorry, Fiona, your slides aren't moving on at the moment. We're stuck on the first one currently.
That's all right. I can hear you, but don't you love technology? Is that moving on at all now?
No, so at the moment we're not seeing your presentation view. We're seeing your editing view. So have you clicked on? Okay, there. So if you just move it on like that, that will work fine for us. Thank you.
I have. Let me. Okay. How's that? Can you see that now? Can you?
We're currently looking at the patient diary in PICU slide. Slide number 4.
Brilliant. Okay. All right. So don't they always say, yeah, most people are afraid of dying during presentations. So I am sorry, I'm having a few technical problems. Okay, so just to recap, the diaries really are offered to any family whose child is admitted into PICU. And what they do is chronicle the stay for that child during that period of critical illness. They're owned by the families, and the nursing team, play specialists and doctors and AHPs essentially will start these little books, and they will then encourage the families to take ownership of them and contribute to them. But essentially what they do is just give that day-to-day story about what's been happening to their child. So what we do understand about admission into a PICU is that it can have a lasting emotional impact, not only to the child, but also to the family. And some relatively recent research will indicate that approximately 60% of families who've had a child who've had a critical illness will experience PTSD. But actually, this understanding of the psychological impact on the child is actually quite under-researched area. Although in adults, we know that it's been well looked at. In fact, we even have nice guidance on how to rehabilitate an adult patient who's been in intensive care. What we also understand, and although I undertook this gathering of this data prior to COVID, is actually for those of us working in healthcare, but in particularly in critical care, there's been a really high emotional stress and emotional burden that's been this experience working in COVID, and also how that's translated to our parents who may have had limited access to their child when they've been in intensive care, and actually in some of our ward areas too. Just a bit of other evidence around post-intensive care syndrome, which then can lead on to either lasting emotional impact and even PTSD, is this work that was done by Joseph Manning in Nottingham, Gillian Coville in St George's, and then some Canadian and American colleagues who actually broke down the understanding of how the impact of critical illness will have on a child and their family. And that obviously will include the physical and cognitive health impact, but that emotional and social health lasting effects that it will have.
Yeah, and I'm very sorry to interrupt you again. We're still not seeing your slides move on at the moment, so we're still stuck on slide number 4.
Okay, all right. All right, I'm going to go on to just slide you and then hopefully you get to see them. So, right, can you see me?
We'll let you carry on now. If the slides don't move on, we'll share these slides with the conference group later on.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks ever so much. So the reason for using a patient diary is that there is evidence to suggest that by having a narrative of what's occurred to the child and to some extent to the family, that their ability then to reflect and debrief on their experience in critical care will help them make sense of that experience, and therefore, and certainly it's been shown in adult studies, to actually reduce the impact of either PTSD or certainly emotional distress post this period of time. So what the update study was doing is looking at the usefulness of patient diaries in the paediatric intensive care environment, of which there's a dearth of evidence around critical care use of diaries in the paediatric population. So my study is a constructivist grounded theory approach, which means it's a qualitative data, capturing of data and in a qualitative approach, but also it's co-constructed with the participants. So it's not just about the researcher building that evidence, it's about working with our participants. And what I was really keen to get was a perspective of both the child, the family, and the staff using the patient diaries. My inclusion criteria was any family who've been offered the diary in the PICU. I'd speak to any child over the age of 4, as long as they were able to discuss it with me, and then any healthcare professional who had used the diary. Exclusion criteria was any child who'd been admitted with either suspected or confirmed abuse, or any child that we didn't expect to survive, and of course if a parent or guardian couldn't consent. I certainly, from an ethical point of view, wanted to make sure that I could also approach any families if after follow-up their child had died, and I'll talk a little bit about that in going forward. So I invited 11 family members to participate during their PICU stay, of which 2 declined. And therefore I interviewed a total of 11 families whilst their child was in PICU. Sadly, 2 children did die, and 3 further families declined the 6-month follow-up post-interview, post-discharge from PICU. Although 11 were invited back. So I invited all of the families back to be interviewed, including those of children who had died, because I wanted to give them the opportunity to speak to me if they wished, but they declined that. So there were 11 families that I interviewed at follow-up. This is quite a difficult slide to see, but the demographics of the patients were quite mixed between elective admissions and emergency admissions. So some had been prepared for PICU and some hadn't. And you can see that during that first initial interview on PICU, it was usually mothers, fathers who I interviewed, and then post PICU discharge, it would include the children, and that is kind of intuitive, really, isn't it? That often the children were either too small or they were too unwell to talk to me. And then for healthcare professionals, I undertook 5 focus group interviews, of which there were a total of 95 nurses and healthcare assistants, including one group that was ward-based nurses, so not just the nurses that were on PICU. So one of the unique aspects around grounded theory, constructive grounded theory approach, is that what we understand as part of our sampling is that as themes come out between interviews and initial interviews, it will then direct the other participants that you will then want to speak to. So my first interviews, I started to hear the stories of the fathers coming through. And then for my subsequent interviews with staff, the role of the nurse in the non-PICU setting also became important. So I was then able to focus my sampling on those groups. So what I'm going to do now is very quickly talk to you about some of the themes that came through. There were a number of categories that came out of the interviews that I undertook, but I'll just give you the headlines of the themes and the initial findings that I've seen. So when we talk about parents in the PICU and their recall of that experience, the aspects around the usefulness of the diaries that they talked about was that the diary then gave them an understanding of what was happening to their child. And in particular, an understanding of when they weren't with their child. So thinking about the night time when they may not be able to be present with their child, and having a really clear picture of how their child was during the night. So it added to the clinical information that they received from either at handover, but added that narrative around how their child was. It created a huge impact emotionally. So the families would talk about being able to express their emotions through the diary. And this is where the experience of fathers became really quite apparent as being different from mothers. So fathers would tell me that they could write things in their diaries that they couldn't say to their child or couldn't say to talked about when the diaries weren't useful and the condition of their child was getting worse, and how the diary then, and this was a very spoke to, that actually they had to put the diary aside because they didn't want to be reminded of actions that the diaries make with their child, their baby or their child as well. Some personality around the caring for them that they hadn't got when they may be worried and talking to them. So the perspective really saw the diaries as being a way of enhancing understanding, but they also saw it as a means of allowing them an opportunity to make sense of what was going on for them. And not also attributing to them things as staying late, for example, or using artwork to actually explain what was happening to that child. When we then looked at follow-up of parents, so this is usually 6 months post PSU, what the parents talked to me about was that they had with their child and how they had the opportunity to go and relive some of that experience, but know what the outcome of that story was. So it was really important that they could use that diary and has it as a way to recall those memories. But again, the emotional impact of having that book and being able to create this emotional attachment to the story of what happened to that child became incredibly important. But it absolutely encouraged that memory and recall and an understanding of that journey and making sense of something when actually it was quite nonsensical to them and when they felt very much out of control. The last things in relation to healthcare professionals also told me was when the diary isn't useful. And health professionals spoke about how it can be really difficult to write bad news and how they found it much easier, as understandably, to write about experiences when the child was getting better, much harder if a child was deteriorating, and how they needed support to maybe think about how to do that in an honest way, but being mindful of the impact it was going to have. They also raised concerns about both professional and legal concerns. So would there be any requirement of diary to be used in a legal setting? And again, the importance of then having support in how to write and how the diary was. And there was a little bit of conflict. And in particular, that was around if they didn't have the time to complete the diary and feeling pressure from families. But also there was peer pressure, particularly those staff members who were particularly artistic and others feeling that they couldn't meet the same standard as another nurse who was able to draw beautiful pictures, etc. And that creates sometimes conflict within the family. And then finally, the healthcare professionals really talked about what else they
Sorry,
found
Fiona.
useful. And actually, it's important to recognise this mirrors what our families
Sorry,
told
Fiona.
us. It was about creating connections with both the child as
Fiona.
well as the family, having an understanding of where the family may be, when actually what was read and written may not be what we may be being told. Hello.
Hi, Fiona. We're just getting close to time. Hiya, sorry, we're just getting close to time for the next presentation. How are you getting on? How close are you? We might need to wrap this up in a minute so we can.
I was just about to finish. But,
thank you so much. Sorry.
I had one slide left. So
thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to finish off. So in conclusion, the diaries have proved to be incredibly positive and a useful tool which is low risk but beneficial to both children and staff and their
We appear to have lost Fiona. I think there was a bad connection there. So thank you very much for your presentation, Fiona.